The Jewish Bible sometimes goes by the acronym Tanakh, which stands for the Hebrew versions of these three words: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, which we'll discuss in a minute. The Jewish Bible is basically what Christians call the Old Testament. However, Jews never use that phrase. They consider that offensive because it suggests there is a newer deal, a newer testament. Christians believe there's a newer testament, a newer scripture, but of course Jews do not. It's best then to just call this the Jewish Bible. The most important part of this are the first 5 books called the Torah, that is, the law. Torah often means just these 5 books. Although it can also have a more general usage, it can mean all of Jewish scripture, or it can mean all of the divinely ordained pattern for Jewish life, as expressed in all Jewish teachings and practices. The Torah is traditionally attributed to Moses, the prophet who we'll talk about in the last segment of this lecture. And it may well contain material from Moses, although it can't be that simple because they describe the death of Moses, and surely he did not write about his own death after the fact. Many scholars would now say that these have material written over a period of some 600 or 700 years. The Torah, and specifically the book of Genesis, starts with God's creation of the world and the first man and woman, gives a history of the patriarchs, the founding fathers of the tradition, and explains the origin of the Jewish people, the Hebrews. These books contain the Mosaic Law. This is a complete law code with rules for religious rituals, but also for everyday life, including ethical precepts and legal issues such as inheritance and penalties for crimes and things like that. The Torah had attained scriptural status in the eyes of most Jews no later than 400 BCE. The second division of the Jewish Bible are the prophets, and these include big long books bearing the names of Isaiah and Jeremiah, for instance, but also, somewhat confusingly, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which deal with the history of the Hebrews during and after the conquest of Canaan. There are many important teachings in the prophets. For one thing, they teach a strident monotheism, that there's only one God. They also sketch beautiful visions of a coming golden age, a coming era of peace. And they have an ethical focus. They focus on compassion and justice in particular. Speaking of monotheism, it's most famously expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, that's the proper name Yahweh in Hebrew, the Lord our God is one Lord. The third main division of the Jewish Bible are the writings. This includes the important book of Psalms, which are ancient song lyrics and prayers. The book of Proverbs, these are the sayings of ancient wise men. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which deal with the captivity of Jews and their return to their homeland, as well as the books of Chronicles and Daniel. There are many genres in the writings. It's kind of a miscellaneous category. There's poetry, there's history, and whereas the prophets had attained scriptural status around 200 BCE, these writings took a little bit longer. They were less central to the collection. Most of these writings were recognized as scripture by around 100 Common Era. There were some later writings that were widely used by ancient Jews. These were written in late BC and early CE times that were eventually excluded from the Jewish Bible, but they had been included in the widely used Septuagint translation, which was done around 260 by a team of Jewish scholars. Many large Jewish communities in these years were very Hellenized, that is, very influenced by Greek culture. And Hebrew, for many of them, had become just a ritual language and an everyday language. So in the 200s BC, 100s BC, 100 CE, that is the first Christian century, a lot of Jews were using the Hebrew scriptures in a Greek translation. And Greek in modern typeface looks like this. Here's the first verse of the Bible. NRK, in the beginning, epoiesin ha theos, God created, ton uranon, the heavens, kai tengein, and the earth. The Septuagint translation was widely used from about 260 up until about 200 Common Era, at which point the Christians were using it, and the Christians were appealing to some of these writings. These later books then that didn't make it into the final Jewish collection are included in some Christian Bibles, and we'll discuss that in a later lecture. The bottom line is the canon was finalized, that is, the collection of scriptures was fully settled by around the year 200 Common Era. Since around the mid-19th century, there's been a lot of so-called critical Bible scholarship. This is scholarship that treats the Bible like any other historical source, and very often speculates about its having different authors and about how the text has been changed through time, what sources people may have used to assemble these books together. And in Judaism, there are basically three reactions to this type of modern scholarship. One reaction is to ignore or repudiate it, and this is most typical of the Orthodox branch of Judaism. Of course, there are always exceptions to these rules. Another extreme reaction, which you find in Reformed Judaism, is to fully accept critical theories and, in a way, devaluate the scriptures, to not consider them any kind of inviolable standard. The third reaction, which you find most often in the conservative wing of Judaism, is to distinguish between obsolete and relevant parts. That is, one takes them as an authority, but doesn't necessarily view them all on the same level. While the Bible is the most important Jewish scripture, it's not the only Jewish scripture. There are a whole bunch of secondary books which are also considered scriptures. First, we have the Mishnah. These are the teachings of about 150 early rabbis, and they were compiled around the years 200 to 220 Common Era. The entire Mishnah was incorporated into a later work called the Talmud, and actually the Talmud exists in two versions. The more important and the bigger version of the Talmud is called the Babylonian Talmud, and this was compiled over a long course of time, between 250 and about 650 Common Era. It's called the Babylonian Talmud because these scholars were based in Babylon, that is, in current-day Iraq. The second and smaller Talmud is the Palestinian Talmud, also called the Jerusalem Talmud, and that was assembled around the year 500 CE. Both of these are basically gigantic commentaries on the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is basically a commentary on the Jewish Bible. The Talmud, then, in either version, is a super commentary. It's a commentary on a commentary. Attitudes towards the Mishnah and Talmud vary somewhat, but the most conservative Jews consider all of them to be divine revelation. In fact, the view is that all of them embody an oral law revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. Rabbinic Judaism has long taught that Moses received a written law, which are the 5 books of the Torah, and he also received an oral law that was only passed down orally, and eventually was codified in the Talmud. Nearly all Common Era Judaism is of this kind. Sometimes it's called the Judaism of the dual Torah, that is, of the oral law and of the written law. The Babylonian Talmud is at least as important to this Judaism as is the Bible, and its interpretations of religious law are considered binding by Orthodox Jews. It's not analogous so much to a Christian Bible commentary as to the Christian New Testament. As a later and more complete divine revelation, it guides how the Tanakh, that is, how the Jewish Bible, is read. A common Christian mistake in understanding Judaism is to suppose that Judaism is more or less the same thing as ancient biblical religion. So a Christian will pick up his Old Testament and read about David and Moses and the prophets and suppose that that's what Judaism is all about. But this ignores more than half of the development of Judaism. It ignores the Mishnah and the Talmud, and it ignores ways that Judaism has developed in response to Christianity. In the next segment, we'll hear the core narrative of the Jewish tradition, which is the story of Abraham and his God.